I wanted to speak today on the 21st century artist and the growth of them as such, in contrast to the commonly espoused notion of perseverance, hard work, and sort of mindless trajectories. And for today, I have my example of the Geisha, the force of beauty and sublimity, muse-like conception of paradise and fantasy, and perfectly synonymous with art at its most transcendent. So, the Geisha. How is she formed? Is she formed by simply proclaiming herself a geisha and offering her geisha gifts to whoever may accept it? No, she's not. She is oftentimes picked for her potential, harnessed, refined, and cultivated until she is ready. And then she is delivered in her fullest expression. And this is a very key point, fullest expression. She does not start at a mini level. She does not develop herself to a certain acceptable standard and then release. No. No one would take her seriously. They would just throw her to the side and say, nope, what are you doing? You're not a geisha. A geisha stands for something transcendent. Therefore, that transcendence has to be upheld by certain standards, and often very rigorous standards at that. The same is true for the artist. The artist represents something transcendent. So, by way of that, they must be held up to something very rigorous, very refining, very strict, Saturnian, disciplined, motivated, and almost austere. The artist cannot be this willy-nilly whimsical force if they want to enact any real value. They cannot just grow, deem themselves ready, and then release. Because once this happens, the release is ultimately bound to that embryonic state, and they become stuck in the embryo phase. They never fully mature, because it's a very tricky path to mature past the embryonic stage when you are already publicly received at your embryonic stage. So I'm going to speak of the values of discipline, hard work, motivation, and ultimately preparation for artists, because it is very hard in an instant gratification culture to hold yourself in the cocoon when you'd much rather spread your wings and become the butterfly right away. But any observer of nature would tell you that a caterpillar emerging from the cocoon before it's ready is ultimately suicide. And I see many artistic suicides through and through, and yet our culture has come to celebrate them. And we have to consider the nuances of perhaps what our cultural standards are evolving to. But that doesn't take away from the fact that what we're offering is not up to transcendent standards. Not at all. And takes a very mature human to offer mature art. And as it is right now, in the present age, in the way things are run, we don't have the pathways to maturity anymore. They're not carved, and they often come in unorthodox ways, which most people are incapable of processing and integrating. Pain is one of the strongest catalysts of maturation, but we as a society of comforts and material progress shun pain in any form. We shun the idea of pain, we prepare and constantly defend ourselves against it, and when it happens, we revert to calling the world a dark, horrid, cruel place full of monsters and men of power who beat us down and da-da-da-da, same old story. No, we need to develop pathways for the maturation of individuals as humans, as artists, as a collective, in order to reach the state of transcendence personified by the geisha. Many would argue that the geisha I'm quite adept at mixing my words today. Many would argue that the personification of the geisha represents a sort of forced adherence, a forced pain, a forced survivalistic state needed to flourish in a society that did not have this woman's interests in mind. And while that may be true, the methods themselves are still valid. Perhaps in less cruel manners, we may adopt those methods, and with self-love, self-respect, self-command, understand that at the principle of growth is that pain, that tension, that dissonance, that rawness that we must essentially harness towards our becoming, and stop believing that we have so much to give just by way of existing. We are beautiful creatures, but our beauty is in our potential. It's not some endowed birthright that automatically, it's complex because I think it is endowed in us and it's innate, but at the same time, that doesn't guarantee that, or that doesn't basically grant us a free pass to having everything we want just because we were born and just because we think we have this thing. We have to go through a process and a cycle that allows us to transform this thing into something that we can give to others. And I think that process and cycle is largely disregarded. But if you think about it, it has its roots in nature. The core of nature represents all sorts of processes and pathways of evolution. And evolution of our art and our personhood is no different. It must take the pain, death, the disassembly, all to refine. I got something pointing in my eye. Oh my goodness. Things I hear. I don't know what it is, but it hurt me. Anyways, it's all sort of entwined with that process towards refinement. And I think nature is the most profound example of that. Look at what we've become from little tiny molecular forces in the ocean. Look at how we have emerged. Look at the vast diversity of nature, of the creatures contained within nature, of the landscapes and in the regions and the cultures and the ecosystems, all contained within that same principle of evolution, refinement, the flow and the force of something stripping away anything that is deemed to not work or to not mesh or to not align with the forces of reality, the forces of nature as a whole. Nature is sort of this self-reflective force who says, okay, this works with that, works with this, works with that, so if it doesn't work, just shove it out. And the same thing should be happening with our artistic process. We should be aware enough to say, okay, this works, this doesn't work, this works, this doesn't work, and begin this deep, reflective process of refinement towards a higher essence of our art, a higher essence of what we are capable of creating and delivering. And this goes hand in hand with personal growth, personal evolution. I mean, art is always going to be reflective of the person's internal state and what they have to give from that. It's only ever capable of reflecting that expanse, because that's what it's essentially pulling from. We need developed humans. We need mature humans. We need mature artists and creators who understand that their gift is the gift of sublimity and transcendence. And like the geisha, they must be crafted through painstaking storms the rigorous training and routine, carving and the sculpting of that which attunes to its medium in a way that is ultimately hyper-augmenting, like a Frankenstein of substance, where we become our art and our art becomes us, and it is granted lifeblood that then has the capacity to float through, travel through the bloodstream of all the planet, and to transform the way people conceive of life as a whole, life in its most profound, expansive sense, as this force of unity and transcendence and momentum towards some height that we could never conceive of otherwise. And it shall always be carved in pain, because pain is the alchemical agent of the psyche. Comfort is anathema. Pain is alchemy through and through. Draws us into heights, draws us into sublime portals. So we must take inspiration from the Geisha. Always and forever pushing towards the heights.